My dear friend, a Jew in Sydney, Australia, told me the very first time that I met her that her grandparents, all of whom were Holocaust survivors, emigrated to Australia after the Shoah, after the war, because Australia was just about the furthest point on Earth from Europe. And they believed that there they could finally be safe and free of antisemitism. There they believed they would be able to practice their Judaism without fear and raise their children to know and to love and to take pride in who they are. There they believed they could live unafraid. In this way, my friend's grandparents, like so many of the approximately 100,000 Jews who call Australia their home, made that place their home. A large percentage of them are survivors and descendants of survivors who chose Australia because of its perceived distance from European anti-Semitism, or who were ostensibly chosen by Australia, given that it was one of the few places in the world that opened its doors to Jewish refugees for immigration after the war. My friend said that her grandparents' vision of a post-war Jewish life, free of hostility and derision, free of violent anti-Semitism, seemed to have become a reality. They, like many other Australian Jews, lived relatively safe and quiet and prosperous lives down under. That is until a couple of years ago, when Australian Jews began to see a dramatic escalation in anti-Semitic sentiment and rhetoric, threats and attacks, like the firebombing of a kosher restaurant and a Melbourne synagogue in December of last year, and then again in July of this year. Over the last week, like many of you, I'm sure, I read and I watched many interviews of Australian Jews after gunmen inspired by the Islamic State attacked the Jewish community as they gathered on Bondi Beach to celebrate Hanukkah. What I heard repeated from members of this community was frustration, fury that their government had failed to take seriously the cries of the community, that a significant portion of the Australian Jewish community had made it abundantly clear that they felt unsafe, that they felt that anti-Semitism had, as they said, entered a more dangerous phase, that serious threats against the community were intensifying over the last 2 years and the last several months. There are always many reasons for government inaction, and I don't know enough about Australian politics to dare to suggest that I understand the reasons for their failure here to protect their citizens. But I do know, and I can speak to an increasingly widespread phenomenon, which I am guessing played a role here too. And that is the fundamental unwillingness or inability to take seriously Jewish pain. That's not only why our claims that we're increasingly unsafe are so often dismissed. It's also why immediately after the shooting, again, a shooting of innocent people on a beach celebrating Hanukkah of a 10-year-old girl named Matilda B. and 2 rabbis, and an elderly Shoah survivor, and a couple that courageously tried to stop one of the gunmen and were shot dead in the street immediately after that shooting, even despite the fact that the gunmen were fairly quickly identified as adherents to the ideology of the Islamic State. Explosive claims roiled the internet that the shooters were Israeli agents, Mossad, or maybe IDF, that this was a false flag operation. I'll tell you what's happening here. Too many people hold a worldview that cannot make space for Jewish pain. You with your 529s and your legacy admissions and your Holocaust museums in every city around the world, your suffering cannot possibly be real. And so when our community is attacked, they deny, they justify, they even celebrate. And at the very same time, Jewish pain has been co-opted to advance a particularly nefarious agenda, to bring higher education to heal, to undermine critical and essential advances in diversity and equity and inclusion, to instill the fear of deportation, to curb the right to free speech, to drive a wedge in this country's most effective and powerful political coalition, the Civil Rights Coalition, responsible for the most robust progressive transformation in American political history. The marriage of these two forces, on one hand, an inability or an unwillingness to see Jewish pain, and on the other, the desire to exploit Jewish pain, to justify the undoing of our democracy, has left our community rattled and uncertain, vulnerable, confused, and left to feel increasingly isolated. This messaging has been so effective. It has penetrated the hearts and minds of far too many people who now conform their worldview to that heartless vision. As so many people said this week, now, when we hear about attacks on the Jewish community around the world, we're stunned, but we're not at all surprised. In many ways, we have come to expect this. But this is not normal. So I want to ask us on this Shabbat what we are to do about it. And I'm going to humbly suggest that even though we feel so powerless amid the onslaught of the reports of the violence of the last week, there are three things that we can do, that we must do, that I draw from this week's confluence of Parshat Miketz on one hand and the holiday of Chanukah on the other. The first is, we must hold our humanity. Our parasha begins with Joseph alone in a prison in Egypt, having been framed for a sexual assault that he did not commit. According to the Midrash, Joseph has languished in that prison for more than 9 years. Last week's parasha, Vayeshev, ends with a very clear articulation of just how hopeless his situation has become. Velo zachar sar hamashkim et Yosef v'yishkachehu. The butler did not remember Joseph. He forgot him. Joseph has been abandoned by his family and forgotten by the only person in the world who could secure his release, the butler, whose dream he interpreted just before the butler was released from prison. But knowing of Joseph's desperation in that moment, I am drawn to what happened just before that state of total abandonment. Here we see an image of Joseph in the depths of his own distress, seeing two men, servants of Pharaoh, who've been thrown into prison beside him. Vayarotam v'hinam zo'afim. He saw them. He saw that they were in deep distress. This is absolutely stunning. Joseph has every reason to be consumed with his own suffering, to not meet the eye of any other person around him. But instead, he looks up in that dungeon prison and he sees that there are others right beside him, and they too are suffering. And so he asks, Madua pneichem ra'im hayom? Tell me, why are you so heartbroken in this moment? What's causing you pain, friends? There's so much tenderness in this interaction between Joseph and the butler and the baker, in a quiet moment between three prisoners, all of whom are victims of a tyrant who needed neither reason nor evidence to discard of all of them. It said, by the way, that the crimes of the butler and the baker were a fly in the wine and a tiny pebble in the bread. Off with their heads, says this tyrant. It's from the very heart of that absolutely nonsensical world that Joseph teaches us that even in our own darkest night, we can and we must choose compassion and curiosity and care. And here I quote the words of Elisha Rabbi from his book Hostage. There is always a choice. Even when you have no control over yourself, you always have a choice. Joseph could have chosen despair, but instead, he refused to harden his heart. He built a bridge. He tried to bring comfort, to share his gifts, even from within the limited space of his containment. And in so doing, he created the possibility of his own eventual redemption, because when he does ultimately come out from that prison more than 2 years later, It's because the butler remembers his kindness. And we must do that too. In these times of so much heartache, we must not retreat from the world. We must not isolate. We must be exactly who we are, only more so. Which takes us to the second idea. We must take care of each other. The rabbis argue that the worst sin that the brothers committed against Joseph, which they realize only in light of this week's parashah, was not that they threw their brother into the pit and ultimately sold him into slavery. The worst sin that they committed was that they failed to hear his cries, to heed his anguish when he was crying out to them, weeping and wailing from within that pit. It was their callousness toward their brother, their failure to muster even the most basic compassion that broke their family. These past 2 years have exposed painful fissures in our own Jewish family. And we must recognize that even serious rifts and serious ideological differences must not break our basic care for and responsibility toward one another. The idea of Kol Yisrael Arevim Zeh B'Zeh, the idea that we're all responsible to each other, may seem like a Pollyannish parochial fantasy. But in crisis moments like the one that we're living through now, we have the opportunity to awaken to the urgent imperative that no matter the geographical, ideological, or political or religious difference between us, we are all responsible for one another. It's our responsibility to comfort and to care for each other, to grieve for and to remember with one another. And here I want to lift up our beautiful ECC teachers and children who, like I'm sure thousands of Jewish children across the diaspora and Israel this week, dedicated their day to making art for the children of Sydney's Jewish community, just to bring some color, some joy to the part of our extended mishpacha that most of us have never met, but to whom we understand we are mysteriously and inextricably connected. And finally, our third lesson. We must be vigilant and we must be discerning. I will not join the parade of people who blame Jews for our own suffering. But it is precisely because I take the threats against our Jewish community so seriously that I must issue this warning. If we are to effectively work to avert future danger, we, our Jewish community, must dramatically shift our approach to addressing anti-Semitism in our time. It is perfectly reasonable, in response to the host of violent anti-Semitic attacks, even just in the past week, even just in the past year. It is perfectly reasonable in light of our fear and our grief and our collective trauma that we take every threat seriously. We have every right to be concerned. And at the same time, if we do not take extreme care in response to this landscape of threat, we will fail to effectively protect ourselves. Immediately after the shooting at Brown University, did you also see the allegations that the shooter had targeted the class of a Jewish professor, and that the MIT professor who was murdered early this week was targeted because he was both a Jew and an outspoken defender of Israel, neither of which happened to be true? Now, it may turn out that anti-Semitism does play some role in the motivation behind these horrible attacks, but it also may not be true. And so I want to ask us, what is the danger of the fever pitch rush to accusations of anti-Semitism? It's this simple. When everything is read through the lens of an anti-Semitic motive, when every attack is seen as evidence of an existential threat to our Jewish community, it becomes impossible to keep our Jewish community safe. If everything reaches the catastrophic threat level, then literally nothing can be taken seriously. And even the word anti-Semitism threatens to become meaningless. It's already becoming white noise for people. Today, some of the very people and organizations that exist ostensibly to protect our people are paradoxically responsible for fueling that fire, for blurring the lines that are absolutely essential in order to keep our people safe. What is the connection between this phenomenon and Hanukkah? When we light the Chanukiah, we are told that we must ensure that each light is an independent, recognizable flame, visually distinct from all of the other flames. In the Shulchan Aruch, it teaches that the candles have to be placed enough apart from one another, lest they appear as though they are one flame. Even separate candles that are placed too close to each other so that they visually merge are considered invalid. This is why a circular Chanukiah is not halachically permitted, lest an observer might perceive two things that are different and distinct from one another as though they are one. Here's what we learn from that. There is a danger in perceiving things that are clearly distinct from one another as though they are the same phenomenon. It now seems clear that the attack in Sydney, like the one in Manchester and many others over these past 2 years, was fueled by people who held great animus toward our Jewish community, who perhaps and likely held all Jews responsible for the actions and policies of the government of the State of Israel, and who wanted to punish all Jews, any Jews, for the devastation in Gaza. And that is a horror, and that is a crisis. And at the very same time, to treat, as many in our community do, every advocate of Palestinian self-determination, every defender of the people of Gaza like a terrorist in waiting, is an act of reckless endangerment, not only to the people who are being accused of that, but to our community itself. This will not keep us safer. This will only prevent us from protecting our community from the very grave and real threats that we face today. Our safety in the days ahead rests on our vigilance, yes. And we must also be very careful and judicious and discerning. 3 messages at the end of another week of heartache. Number 1, even in the darkest hour, we must be exactly who we are in the world, but even more so. We must remain compassionate and curious and caring. Number 2, even at a time of painful division in our Jewish community, we must continue to stretch our hearts to hold tenderness toward one another, especially when that feels most difficult. And number 3, even amid and despite the great threats to our people, or precisely because of them, we must not lose our ability to distinguish real from perceived threats. I want to close with the words of Lena Chernick, Matilda's aunt, which she spoke at the funeral this week. People are angry, she said, and people want more to be done, and I want more to be done. But I do not want to live in anger. I want people not to hold anger in their hearts, but instead to plant the seeds of happiness and joy. As much as I am in pain, I don't want anyone else to feel this pain. Where is our power, she asks? Our power is in spreading happiness and love in memory of my lovely niece, Matilda. And so in memory of a little girl named Matilda, who went to the beach with her family and loved bumblebees, and in memory of all of the victims of this past week of such terrible, senseless violence, let us hear the voice of the bereaved. May our anger and our fear and our grief help us rededicate ourselves toward building a world of joy, a world of safety and peace and human dignity for every person, a world of love. Shabbat Shalom.